Oh my God. Mas it'd be like a double life strobe on his. Yeah!
There is a moment, and most people who have lived long enough have had it where the world, as you understood it, stops being the world as it actually was. It does not announce itself. It does not come with a warning or a drum roll or any of the signals you might expect from something that is about to change everything. It comes as a phone call, a sentence that begins with the words, "There has been an incident." And before whoever is on the other end can finish what they are saying, something inside you already knows. Not the details, not the specifics, just the shape of the thing, the irreversible, undeniable shape of the thing. That is where this story begins. Not at the beginning, because the beginning happened 11 years before the phone call. It begins the way all great unravelings begin, with a Tuesday afternoon that looked, from the outside, like every other Tuesday afternoon that had ever existed. His name was Richard Calloway. He was 53 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that people tended to trust on sight, open, steady, the face of a man who would help you move a couch on a Saturday and remember your kids' names at Christmas. He drove a late-model Ford pickup truck. He coached youth baseball for 4 seasons in a row. He went to church on the important holidays. By every surface measurement that the people who knew him could apply, Richard Calloway was a decent, ordinary, unremarkable American man. He was also, for 11 years and 4 months, living 2 completely separate lives in 2 completely separate states, maintaining 2 mortgages, 2 sets of utility bills, 2 families who had never heard each other's names, 2 women who believed with their whole hearts that they were his only wife, and he had been doing it so successfully for so long that the only thing that finally broke it open was the fact that his heart gave out in the wrong house. Before we go any further, before we follow Richard Calloway through the mechanics of what he built and why and how it stayed standing for over a decade, I want to tell you something about the 2 women at the center of this story. Because this is not Richard's story. Not really. Richard is the mechanism. He is the architect of the deception. But the story that matters, the one that I have spent a considerable amount of time putting together, drawing on documented accounts of real cases just like this one, on court records and interviews, and the kind of detail that only surfaces years after the fact, that story belongs to Linda and to Carol. 2 women, 2 cities, 400 miles between them, and not a single shared secret between them, until the afternoon, a hospital in Tennessee made 2 phone calls in quick succession, and both women answered, and the world, as each of them had built it, stopped making sense at the same moment. What I'm going to show you in this documentary is not just what Richard did. What I'm going to show you is how something like this is possible, how a man sustains a double life not for weeks or months, but for 11 consecutive years, without either woman ever knowing. I'm going to walk you through the architecture of the deception because it was an architecture, as deliberately designed as any house either of those women ever lived in. And at the end of it, I am going to ask you a question, not a rhetorical one, a real one, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer. There are 3 questions that will follow us through every minute of this documentary. The first is the most practical. How did he do it? How does a man maintain 2 households, 2 marriages, 2 full emotional lives, in 2 different states, across more than 4,000 days, without a single slip that either woman could not explain away? The second question is harder. Were there signs? Because there are always signs. There is never a deception of this scale that does not leave a trail, however faint. The question is not whether the signs existed, they did. The question is what it means that the people who cared most about seeing them were also the people most motivated to look away. And the third question, and this is the one that will stay with you longest, is what happens to 2 women who have never met, who have nothing in common except that the same man lied to both of them for 11 years? When they're placed in the same hospital waiting room at the same moment? What happens between them, what they say to each other, and what they decide to do next? Keep watching, because the answer to that third question is the reason I am telling you this story. Linda Calloway was 51 years old at the time of the incident, and she was, by any reasonable account, a woman who had earned her life. She had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, the middle child of 3, in a household that was loving but not extravagant. The kind of upbringing where you learned early that things did not come to you, that you went to things. She had put herself through 2 years of community college, transferred to a 4-year state school on a partial scholarship, and graduated with a business administration degree in the late 1990s. She had worked her way into a mid-level management position at a regional insurance firm over the course of 12 years, and she was, by the time this story takes place, a woman with a salary, a retirement account, 2 teenage children, and a house in a suburb of Columbus that she had spent 7 years turning into exactly the home she wanted it to be. She had been married once before Richard, briefly, in her late 20s, a marriage that lasted 14 months and ended by mutual agreement with no particular bitterness on either side. She did not talk about it much. When she married Richard, in the late spring of 2007, she was 33 years old, and she did it with the deliberateness of someone who had thought carefully about what she was choosing. She chose him. That detail matters enormously, because what follows is not a story about a woman who was swept up in something before she could think straight. Linda Calloway thought straight. She was precise and clear-eyed, and she had looked at this man from every angle she knew how to look from, and she had decided he was worth choosing. She was right about almost everything she believed about him. She was wrong about one thing, but that one thing was the size of a second life. Carol Merritt was 47 years old, and she lived in a small house on the east side of Nashville, Tennessee, in a neighborhood where the streets curved gently and the houses were far enough apart that you could sit on your front porch without hearing your neighbor's television. She had grown up in Knoxville, the daughter of a high school football coach and a kindergarten teacher, and she carried that background in the way people carry the places that shaped them, not loudly, but present. She was warm in the particular way that people from smaller southern cities can be warm, genuinely, without calculation, in a way that made strangers feel that she had been waiting for them specifically. She worked as an office manager at a dental practice she had been with for 9 years. She baked things for the staff on Fridays. She knew all of her neighbors by first name. She kept a jar of peppermint candies on the kitchen counter because Richard liked them, and she had been keeping it stocked for 8 years. Carol had met Richard in the fall of 2010. 3 years after his marriage to Linda had already been legally performed in an Ohio courthouse. She met him at a diner near her office, where he had been eating lunch alone and had asked if he could share a table because the place was crowded and she had the last available seat. They had talked for 45 minutes. He had left her a business card. She had kept it in her coat pocket for 2 weeks before she called. She was not impulsive. She was careful. She thought it through, and when she eventually said yes, she said it to a man who had told her he was a widower, that he had been married young, that his wife had passed, and that he had spent several years finding his footing again. She believed him without question. She had no reason not to. He was the most convincing widower she had ever met. He was also not a widower at all. Richard Calloway had grown up in a small town in western Kentucky, one of 4 children. And by all accounts, he had been an unremarkable but pleasant child, good enough in school to avoid trouble, athletic enough to have friends, charming enough to be liked by most adults who encountered him. He was not the smartest person in any room he had ever been in, but he was, by a significant margin, the most socially fluent. He read people the way some people read weather quickly, instinctively, without having to think about it. He knew what someone needed to hear before they had finished telling him what was wrong. He was the person at every party who made the shy guest feel included, who remembered the name of your elderly mother, who gave the kind of toast at a wedding that made the bride cry in a good way. He had taken that ability and built a career around it in industrial sales, traveling to companies, building relationships, closing contracts, and the travel, which was genuine and verifiable and occurred on a predictable schedule, gave him the infrastructure that made everything else possible. He was not, by any clinical definition that I'm aware of, a sociopath. The people who knew him best, and it says something that the people who knew him best knew only half of him, described him consistently as a man who seemed to genuinely love the people in his life. The consensus, assembled across multiple accounts, was that Richard Calloway was a man who could not say no to a life that felt good. He had found one life that felt good, and then he had found a second one, and he had not been able to bring himself to give either of them up. I want you to hold that thought, because it is going to complicate your feelings about this story in ways you may not be prepared for. In the early years, Linda Calloway's marriage looked like exactly what she had designed it to look like. Richard traveled for work, which he had been upfront about from their first date 3 weeks out of every month, sometimes more during the fourth quarter when contracts needed closing before year-end. It was not ideal, she had told him clearly. She was a practical woman, and she understood that ideal was a conversation for people who had more options than she did. She was a working mother with a daughter from her first relationship and a life that required a partner who showed up with consistency, not one who was present for every moment. Richard, she said once, showed up. That was the phrase she used. He showed up. He came home from his trips and brought the kids small things from wherever he had been. He remembered the dates that mattered. He fixed what was broken around the house before she had finished deciding whether it was worth mentioning. They had their second child together, a boy, whom they named Daniel, in 2009, 2 years into the marriage. Linda described those years as the fullest of her life. Not the easiest, but the fullest. There was work and children and the particular exhaustion of a household running at full capacity, and in the middle of all of it was Richard, who came home on the Thursday flights and cooked dinner on Friday nights and sat at the kitchen table helping with homework on Sunday mornings, with a patience that she had never had to ask him to perform. She did not take that for granted. She told her sister once that she had gotten lucky, that she had found a good man. Her sister, who had been married to a difficult man for 12 years, had smiled and said she was happy for her. Neither of them knew that 400 miles south, in a house in Nashville, a woman named Carol was making the same calculation and reaching the same conclusion about the same man. The fall of 2010 was, by any retrospective analysis, the most consequential season of Richard Calloway's life. He was in Nashville for a 4-day sales conference. He was staying at a hotel near the airport. He was, by his own admission in documents that surfaced later, feeling a particular restlessness, not dissatisfaction with Linda or with their marriage, but the low-grade hunger of a man who had always needed more than one source of warmth to feel fully alive. That sounds like a rationalization, and perhaps it is. But it is the version of events that was documented, and I am going to tell you what was documented. He met Carol on a Wednesday afternoon. He took her card on a Thursday. He flew home to Columbus on a Friday and was, by all accounts, his usual warm and present self at the dinner table that night. He was already thinking about how to call her. He called her 2 weeks later, after he had done what, looking back, constitutes a significant amount of deliberate planning. He had already considered the logistics of what a second relationship would require. He had already mapped out how his travel schedule could accommodate it. He had already decided on the story, the widower story, because it explained his emotional availability without creating questions about where he was the rest of the time. He had thought it through the way he thought through his sales strategy, methodically, thoroughly, with attention to the pressure points. None of this is speculation. Some of it came from Richard himself, in conversations that were recorded months after the incident, when the weight of what he had carried for 11 years had finally given him something he had never shown either woman in all that time. Not guilt, not exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who had been performing two versions of himself every day for more than a decade and was now, finally, too tired to perform either one. What Richard built between 2010 and 2018 was not the work of an impulsive man. It was a system, 2 phones, each with its own plan under its own name, 2 email addresses, one of which Carol and Linda respectively knew about, and a third that neither knew about, used for the logistics of managing both. His work territory, which covered a genuine multi-state region in industrial manufacturing, provided a baseline explanation for travel that neither woman had any particular reason to investigate. He paid both mortgages from the same primary account, routing the payments through a secondary account that appeared on statements as a business expense. He kept his schedules on a physical calendar that he carried with him and which he destroyed at the end of every year. He had trained himself, over time, to refer to each woman only by name in the other's presence, never as my wife, never as my family. Constructions that might accidentally transfer. The holidays were the most demanding operational period of his year. Christmas required him to be in Ohio on Christmas Eve, in Tennessee by Christmas dinner, and back in Ohio by the 27th, which was when Linda's extended family typically gathered. He did it for 8 consecutive years. He drove rather than flew during holiday periods because flight records were discoverable in a way that a car trip was not. He had considered this. Thanksgiving split more easily because Linda's family typically gathered on the Thursday and Carol's on the Saturday. His birthday, which fell in late March, was the one day each year that he spent alone in a hotel room somewhere between the two cities, unreachable by either woman, because he had never found a way to split a birthday that did not carry its own particular kind of risk. He told Linda he preferred to treat his birthday as a travel day. He told Carol the same. Both women had respected that preference for years without finding it strange. People have quirks. Married life accommodates quirks. That is one of the things that made this so hard to detect from the inside. There is a woman I want you to think about for a moment. She is sitting at a kitchen table in Columbus, Ohio, sometime in the spring of 2016. She has just found a receipt in the pocket of a jacket her husband left in the hall closet before his most recent trip. The receipt is from a home improvement store in Tennessee. There is nothing extraordinary about a home improvement store receipt. Richard had explained, in passing, that he sometimes did work on a rental property he held in Tennessee, an investment, he had said, from years back. She had not pressed for details because there was no reason to press for details. The receipt went back in the jacket pocket. The jacket went to the dry cleaner. The receipt was lost. Linda filed that moment in the place where people file the things they do not want to examine, and moved forward with her Tuesday. Carol, for her part, had her own receipts. Not literal ones. Carol's were more textural. The time she had called Richard and he had picked up on the first ring, laughing, and then stepped outside to continue the conversation. The time she had found a toothbrush in a hotel toiletry bag that was not the one she had packed for him. The weekend in the summer of 2015 when he had seemed genuinely distracted in a way she could not account for. And when she had asked him what was wrong, he had said work, and she had believed him because she always believed him. There is a specific kind of unease that lives just below knowing. It is not suspicion exactly. It is more like a note that is slightly off-key. You hear it, you file it somewhere, and then life moves on, and you forget you filed it. Both women had been filing those notes for years. Neither had yet allowed herself to follow them to the place they all pointed. Before we go any further into this story, take a moment to drop your location in the comments below. We would love to know where you are watching from. People find us from all 50 states, and it always moves us to see how wide this community reaches. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do that now. Hit the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We have more stories like this one coming, and you are going to want to be here for them. Now, back to Richard Calloway on the Tuesday afternoon that ended 11 years of a double life in a single hour. It was a Tuesday in early October, the kind of day that Tennessee does well, a sky that could not decide between gray and blue, the temperature sitting in that specific autumn range where a light jacket is either exactly right or slightly too warm, depending on the time of day. Richard had been at Carol's house for 4 days. He was scheduled to leave Thursday morning, drive north, and be back in Linda's kitchen for dinner by early evening. He had done this so many times that the transition had its own muscle memory. Pack on Thursday morning, text Linda from the road at the 2-hour mark. Stop for gas and a coffee somewhere in Kentucky because he preferred to arrive without needing to stop in the last stretch. He had the whole thing choreographed. He had been choreographing it for years. On this particular Tuesday, he mowed the lawn in the morning and sat on Carol's back porch for an hour in the early afternoon, reading a magazine with a glass of iced tea, sweating rings onto the armrest. Carol watched him through the kitchen window while she was washing dishes. She said later that she had stood there longer than the dishes required, watching him turn the pages slowly, the way a man reads when he is not in a hurry to get anywhere. She thought, standing at that window, that she was lucky. She used that word specifically, lucky. She set it down carefully in her memory, the way you do when you want to hold on to something. She did not know that 40 minutes later, she would be on the phone with a 911 dispatcher, her hand shaking so badly that she had to switch the phone to her other hand, and that the version of her life she had been holding on to for 8 years would be gone. She did not know any of that while she was watching him turn the pages of his magazine. She just knew she was lucky, and she held that. Richard Calloway collapsed in Carol's living room at approximately 2:40 inches the afternoon on a Tuesday in October. Carol heard the sound. She described it later as not the dramatic fall she had expected from television, but something quieter and more terrible, a sound like a person sitting down suddenly and wrong, and she ran from the kitchen and found him on the floor beside the couch, conscious but barely, his face the color of old concrete, his breathing labored in a way that she recognized immediately as wrong. She called 911. She was on the phone for 4 minutes before the paramedics arrived. She described his symptoms clearly and correctly. She gave his age, his weight as best she knew it, his name, his real name, Richard Calloway. She had no reason to give any other name. In 8 years, she had never had cause to doubt that the name she had for him was the name he had for himself. The paramedics arrived and began working on him immediately. They stabilized him enough to transport. Carol grabbed her purse and her keys and was told by one of the paramedics that she could follow in her own car. She could not ride in the ambulance without being family. She told him she was his wife. She rode in the ambulance. At the hospital, she was taken to a waiting room, and a nurse came to her with a clipboard and a set of intake questions that are standard in any emergency admission. Name of patient, date of birth, known allergies, primary care physician, emergency contacts. Carol answered every question from memory. Without hesitation, she had been accumulating this information for 8 years, the way spouses do, without ever consciously deciding to memorize it. It was just the knowledge that accumulates when someone becomes the center of your daily life. She answered every question. On the line that said relationship to patient, she wrote wife. And she was, in every functional sense that she could perceive, exactly that. The nurse thanked her and walked away. Carol sat in the plastic chair. She folded her hands in her lap the way her mother had taught her to sit when she was nervous as a child, and she waited. She did not cry yet. She told me later that the crying would come, but not yet. Not in that plastic chair. The adrenaline was still too loud for anything else to get through. She sat in the fluorescent light of a hospital waiting room in Nashville, Tennessee, and she waited to hear whether the man she had built her adult life around was going to survive. She did not know that 400 miles north, in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, her husband's second phone, the one in the inside pocket of his travel bag, the one with Linda's number saved at the top of the contacts list under the name home, had just been found by a hospital administrator who was trying to locate the patient's next of kin. Linda Calloway was at her desk at work when her cell phone rang. She did not recognize the number, but she recognized the area code Tennessee, and she answered it the way you answer an unfamiliar number in the middle of a workday, with a slight edge of impatience, because she was in the middle of a spreadsheet and she assumed it was a spam call. It was a hospital social worker named Deborah. Deborah introduced herself and her institution, and she said the words that no one ever wants to hear from a stranger. "I am calling about your husband, Richard Calloway. He is here with us, and I want to let you know what is happening." Linda's first response, she told me later, was to feel a strange and absolute stillness, the way a room feels in the seconds after a glass has been knocked off a table and before it has hit the floor. Everything suspended, everything very quiet. She did not say anything. She waited. Deborah told her that Richard had been admitted with a cardiac event, that he was in surgery, that the prognosis was cautiously optimistic, and that they had found her number as an emergency contact on a phone discovered in his belongings. There was a pause. Linda did not fill it. Deborah filled it instead, carefully, in the way that people who deal with complicated situations professionally learn to fill silences. She said, "There is also another person here who has listed herself as next of kin." Linda asked her to repeat that. Deborah repeated it. Another person, also his wife. Linda held the phone for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "What is her name?" Deborah said the name, Carol Merritt. Linda had never heard that name in 11 years of marriage. She had never heard the name Carol associated with Richard in any context. And yet, sitting at her desk in Columbus with a spreadsheet open on her screen and her coffee going cold in the cup beside her keyboard, she felt the specific, nauseating recognition of something she had known but never allowed herself to know. She said she felt it in her body before she felt it in her mind. She told her manager she needed to leave. She drove home. She packed a bag with the efficiency of someone who had decided something irrevocable, packing without thinking, because thinking would have required her to decide what she felt, and she was not ready to decide what she felt. She loaded the bag into her car. She pulled out of her driveway on a Tuesday afternoon in October and pointed the car south on Interstate 71. She did not call Richard's phone. She did not call her sister or her friends. She drove 4 hours south, through the lower corner of Ohio and the full length of Kentucky and into the top of Tennessee. And when the GPS directed her off the highway and through the streets to the hospital, she followed it without speaking, without the radio on, in a silence that she described later as the loudest silence she had ever experienced. She parked. She walked through the automatic doors of the emergency entrance, and sitting in a plastic chair on the far side of the waiting room, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the floor, was Carol. There are moments in a story where you have to stop and ask yourself whether the thing you are recounting is actually true, whether a thing this precise, this terrible, this specific in its coincidences and its timing could have genuinely happened the way it is described. I want to tell you that this is one of those moments. Two women who had never met, who had never heard each other's names, who had been living parallel versions of the same marriage in two different states for 8 of the 11 years that marriage had existed, sitting in the same hospital waiting room, looking at the same man's name on the same clipboard, in the same city where neither of them actually lived. That is not a narrative device. That is what happened. And what happened next, between them, is the thing that this story is actually about. Linda walked to the reception desk and gave her name. The hospital administrator, who had, by this point, been briefed on the situation by Deborah, handled it with a professionalism that probably saved everyone in that room from something much worse. She asked Linda to take a seat. She pointed gently toward a cluster of chairs on the opposite side of the room from where Carol was sitting. Linda sat. She looked across the room. Carol looked up. And for a long moment, both women have described this moment, and both descriptions are remarkably consistent. Neither of them moved. They just looked at each other. Linda said later that Carol looked exactly like the kind of woman she would have liked in any other context. Carol said later that Linda looked like a woman who had been prepared for something her whole life without ever knowing what it was. It was Carol who moved first. She stood up and crossed the waiting room and sat down in the empty chair, 2 seats from Linda, leaving one chair between them like a buffer. She said, quietly, "How long?" She did not say how long, what. She did not need to. Linda said, 11 years. We got married in 2007, and Carol said, I have been with him since 2010. They were both quiet for a long time after that. Then Linda said, did he tell you he was a widower? And Carol closed her eyes. She closed them, and she kept them closed for long enough that Linda counted to herself in the silence. She was not crying. She was doing something more internal than that, something that does not have a clean name. The private reckoning of a person who has just watched a large section of her history reclassify itself without her consent. In the days that followed, Richard remained in the hospital for 6 days following his cardiac surgery, which was successful in the narrow sense that he survived it. Both women began the particular work of demolishing and reassembling the structures of their understanding. They did it separately at first, each in her own city, each working through the documents that a shared life produces over years. Linda found the secondary bank account statements within 48 hours, accessing them through the online banking portal she had used jointly with Richard since the first year of their marriage. Carol found, in a shoebox at the top of Richard's closet at her house, a folder of receipts that she had never been shown, from a mortgage company in Columbus. 2 mortgage payments, 12 consecutive years, the same name on both. There were 2 life insurance policies, taken out in different years with different companies. Linda was the beneficiary of one. Carol was the beneficiary of the other. Each policy was for a substantial enough amount that it represented real planning, not the incidental financial administration of a man who had let things accumulate accidentally, but a deliberate provision for both of the lives he intended to maintain. It was the insurance policies that completed the picture for both women in a way that the mortgages and the bank accounts had only begun. Because an accidental second relationship does not produce dual life insurance policies. A man who stumbled into a second marriage out of weakness or opportunity does not sit down with 2 separate insurance agents in 2 separate states and sign 2 separate policies naming 2 separate women as the people whose futures he is providing for. That is not weakness. That is a plan. And recognizing it as a plan changed something in both women that could not be changed back. In the weeks after the incident, as the story began to circulate in the way that stories of this size and texture inevitably circulate, People who had known Richard Calloway from one side or the other began the quiet, uncomfortable process of reviewing what they had known. A colleague of Richard's who had worked alongside him for 6 years at his company told me that he had always assumed the woman Richard called on the phone during their lunch breaks was his wife. It was one of them. He had just never asked which city she was calling from, and Richard had never indicated that the question had any relevance. A neighbor of Carol's had seen Richard mowing her lawn on a Saturday morning dozens of times over the years, and had simply understood him as a man who worked away from home frequently. Nothing unusual there. Lots of people travel for work. The neighborhood had plenty of them. What is striking about almost every peripheral account is not that people were deceived. People are deceived. What is striking is how little anyone questioned the texture of the situation, because Richard himself never gave them anything to question. He was consistent. He was present in the ways that mattered. He remembered your name and your children's names and the name of your dog. He called when he said he would call. He arrived when he said he would arrive. He was, on the surface and by every social measurement available, a reliable man. And when you are dealing with a person who is consistently reliable in the things you can measure, the tendency is to assume reliability in the things you cannot. That assumption is not stupidity, it is trust. And trust, when it is met with the kind of calculation Richard applied to his, functions as camouflage. The most dangerous thing about a well-maintained lie is that it looks exactly like the truth. Richard Calloway regained consciousness on the second day after his surgery in a hospital room in Nashville, Tennessee, and found both Linda and Carol in the room with him. That is a sentence worth sitting with. He had spent 11 years and 4 months ensuring that those two women would never occupy the same space. He had managed a calendar, 2 phone lines, 2 sets of financial accounts, 2 entirely separate social worlds, and the collective trust of an extensive network of people who liked and respected him, all in service of keeping those 2 women apart. And there they were, standing on opposite sides of his hospital bed. Looking at him, he did not speak for a very long time. Both women have described the same thing independently. He looked at the ceiling, not at either of them, at the ceiling. Linda was the one who spoke first. She asked him a single question. She asked it in the tone she used for her work calls: precise, unhurried, utterly controlled. She asked him, "Is there anything I do not already know?" And Richard, who had built a career and 2 marriages on his ability to give people exactly what they needed to hear, looked at the ceiling of a hospital room in Nashville and said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, no. It was not an answer that satisfied either woman. It was not meant to. It was the answer of a man who had run out of the only currency he had ever reliably traded in, which was his ability to construct a version of events that a person who loved him would accept. He had no version left. Both of the people who would have accepted it were standing in the same room, looking at him with the same eyes, and there was nowhere left to go. In the days that followed, in conversations that were recorded at the request of Linda's attorney, Richard provided what could most charitably be described as a partial accounting. He confirmed the basic facts: 2 marriages, 2 households, 11 years for Linda, 8 for Carol. He confirmed the financial arrangements. He confirmed the insurance policies. What he did not provide, what he was constitutionally unable to provide, it seemed was a why that meant anything. He said, in one of those recordings, that he had never intended for it to go this far, that it had started as something temporary, and that temporary had extended and extended until temporary was simply what his life looked like. Linda's attorney noted in her case files that when she played that portion of the recording back for Linda, Linda's response had been a long silence, followed by a single sentence. A temporary lie that runs for 4,000 days is not a lie. It is a life, and he chose it every morning. Carol's response to the recordings, when she eventually heard them, was different. Not less devastating, but different in texture. Carol had built her relationship with Richard on a foundation of what she understood to be emotional honesty. He had presented himself to her as a man who had been through loss, who had been guarded but was learning to be open again, who valued their relationship specifically because it had required something of him. The widower story was not incidental. It was the architecture of their connection. Learning that the widower story was a fabrication did not just reveal that Richard had lied to her. It revealed that the version of Richard she had fallen in love with, the careful, recovering, emotionally present man, had been constructed specifically to be lovable. He had not given her himself. He had given her a character, and the character had worked. Bigamy is a felony in most United States jurisdictions. The specific charge, penalties, and prosecutorial appetite for pursuing it vary significantly by state, but the legal framework is clear. A person who enters into a marriage while already legally married to another person has committed a crime. Richard Calloway's situation was, from a legal standpoint, relatively straightforward in its classification and considerably more complicated in its execution. He had married Carol in Tennessee in 2012. 5 years into his marriage to Linda, there was a marriage certificate. There was a ceremony. There were witnesses who had attended a wedding they had no reason to believe was anything other than what it appeared to be. Carol's family had been there. Her coworkers had given toasts. It had all the texture of a legal marriage because Carol had believed, and had had every reason to believe, that it was one. Linda pursued the legal process through the Ohio courts. Carol, after considerable reflection, did not. Both women arrived at their decisions independently and for reasons that were entirely their own. I am not here to evaluate which choice was correct, because both choices were responses to the same wound from two different nervous systems, and what one person needs in the aftermath of something like this is not necessarily what another person needs. What the legal process could offer was accountability in the narrow sense, a record, a finding, a consequence that existed outside both women's private experiences of what had happened. What it could not offer was the thing both of them actually wanted, which was a coherent explanation for how a man they had both loved and trusted had decided, repeatedly and deliberately, that his need to have everything outweighed their right to know the truth of their own lives. 3 weeks after Richard was discharged from the hospital, he went to stay with a cousin in Kentucky, having been asked to leave both homes simultaneously, which was a sentence neither woman ever expected to say in their lifetimes. Linda picked up her phone in Columbus, Ohio, and called Carol in Nashville. She had found the number through a contact at the attorney's office. She had composed what she wanted to say in the car the night before, while her kids were at a friend's house and she had the house to herself. She had sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside, running through it. She knew, going into the call, that it was strange, that there was no script for it, that she was about to call a woman who had, technically, been her husband's second wife, and that the conversation she was initiating did not have a cultural template. She called anyway. Carol almost did not answer. She said later that she stood in her kitchen looking at the incoming number, which she did not yet have saved, but recognized from the area code for 10 rings. She counted them. Then she picked up. Linda said, "I don't know why I'm calling exactly." And Carol said, "I do." There was a long pause. Then Carol said, "I keep going over it. I keep trying to find the thing I missed." Linda said, "Me too." That was the beginning of something that I do not think either woman expected to last as long as it has. It was not a friendship in the conventional sense. Not at first. It was the specific, strange solidarity of two people who had been through the same event and who had, between them, the only complete picture of what that event had actually been. They talked on the phone for 2 hours that first time. They covered no ground that could be called practical. They just talked about what they had believed, about the version of him they had each known, about the particular loneliness of grieving someone who had not died. Over the months that followed, the calls continued, not daily, not always, even weekly, but with a consistency that neither woman had planned for or expected. They talked through the legal processes, each supporting the other through proceedings that had no real precedent in either of their lives. They talked about their children, Linda's teenagers, Carol's grown stepchildren from a previous relationship who had come to regard Richard as a fixture of the household. They talked about the moment each of them had almost known but had not let themselves know, the receipts and the phone calls and the slight wrongness that they had each filed away. They were not processing toward the same destination, but they were processing, and they were doing it in parallel, and that turned out to be something neither of them could have done alone, because the only person who could fully understand what Linda was experiencing was Carol, and the only person who could fully understand what Carol was experiencing was Linda. And they were the last two people in the world you would have expected to become each other's witnesses. Richard Calloway's life, after October of 2018, contracted in the way that lives contract when the social infrastructure they depend on is removed. The legal proceedings in Ohio produced a result that reflected both the strength of the evidence and the reluctance of the system to apply the full weight of bigamy statutes to a case that did not involve fraud for financial gain in the traditional sense. He received probation. There was a fine. The marriage to Carol was annulled. His marriage to Linda ended in divorce, finalized 14 months after the hospital incident. He lost both houses, the Ohio property in the divorce settlement, the Tennessee property in the annulment proceedings, which unwound the financial entanglement between them with a thoroughness that his attorney later described as unusually complete. He moved to Louisville, Kentucky. He took a regional sales position with a different company. Linda described him, by the end of the legal process, as a bureaucratic problem to be resolved. Not with bitterness, she was very specific about that. Not with the particular heat of someone who still had something to feel. With the flat accuracy of someone who had moved so far past a thing that it had ceased to generate temperature. He was the mortgage, the accounts, the insurance policies that had to be formally separated and rewritten. He was documents. He was correspondence through attorneys. He was a series of obligations that the legal system had converted into procedural steps. And when the procedural steps were completed, he was gone. She said she did not think about him often. When she did, she said she thought about him the way you think about a structural flaw in a house you used to live in, something you identified, something you dealt with, something that is no longer your problem. Carol said something similar, in different language. She said she had put him down, like something heavy she had been carrying without realizing she had been carrying it. She had simply set it down and walked away. I want to spend the last few minutes of this story on something that I think matters more than the legal outcome, or the financial settlements, or the specific contours of how Richard Calloway managed what he managed. I want to talk about what this story is actually about, because I do not think it is about deception, exactly. Or rather, I do not think deception is the most important thing in it. What I keep coming back to, what I cannot put down no matter how many times I walk away from it, is the question of what it costs to love someone. What you give up when you decide to trust a person. In terms of your own ability to see clearly, Linda Calloway was not an unintelligent woman. Carol Merritt was not an unintelligent woman. Both of them were, by any reasonable measure, more observant and more emotionally attuned than the average person. And both of them spent years filing away the notes that did not quite fit because they loved a man who came home and cooked dinner and remembered the things that mattered. Richard did not succeed because he was extraordinary. He succeeded because trust is not a condition of uncertainty. Trust is a condition of certainty. It is the decision to proceed as though something is true because the evidence you have access to supports it and because the cost of not proceeding would be the destruction of something you have chosen to build. Linda and Carol were not naive. They were loving. And the thing that made them loving, the willingness to extend certainty to a person who had earned their certainty over years, was the exact thing that made them vulnerable to someone who had decided to exploit that certainty without limit. That is not their failure. That is not a lesson about what they should have done differently. It is a fact about what love requires and about what happens when the person you have extended it to does not deserve it. There is one more thing I want to say before I ask you the question I have been holding for the entire length of this documentary. The two women in this story, the women who ended up in the same waiting room in Nashville, Tennessee, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, who spoke to each other across the strange gulf of a shared deception, they are not defined by what Richard did to them. Linda went back to work. She remodeled the kitchen of her Columbus house the way she had always wanted to, without having to negotiate the color of the cabinets with anyone. Her daughter is in college now. Her son plays baseball, which she coaches. She took it over from a departing volunteer, and she's been doing it for 2 years. And she is, by all accounts, a good coach. Carol retrained as a legal advocate for financial fraud victims. She has a particular gift, apparently, for clients who are dealing with the specific emotional aftermath of having been systematically deceived by someone they trusted. She does not require them to explain why they didn't see it coming. She already knows. Here is the question I promised you. Not the ones about how he did it, or why, or whether justice was served. Those have answers, and I've given them to you as completely as I can. This question does not have an answer. Not a clean one. Here it is. If you were Linda, if you were Carol, would you have seen it coming? And before you say yes, I want you to consider what that yes actually requires. It requires you to believe that you would have followed the receipt from the home improvement store, that you would have pressed on the slightly too quick phone call, that you would have interrogated the story about the rental property in Tennessee rather than accepting it. Because what kind of person interrogates their spouse about a rental property they have mentioned in passing? I want you to think about what it would have meant to pursue those notes that were slightly off-key, what it would have cost, what it would have said about you as a partner, as a person, as someone who had made the decision to trust. And I want you to think about whether the belief that you would have seen it coming is actually protecting you from something. Because most of us, at a safe distance from a story like this, want very much to believe we would have known. That instinct is understandable. It is also the same instinct that makes a deception of this scale possible in the first place. The certainty that it could not be happening is the cover under which it happens. I'm not saying be suspicious of the people you love. I'm saying hold this story gently. Leave room for the fact that intelligence and emotional attunement are not protection against someone who has decided to use your love as a tool. And then tell me in the comments below what you think, because I read every one of them, and I have yet to read one that did not teach me something. Before you go, and I mean this, drop your city in the comments. I ask this at the end of every story, and every time I do, the comment section fills up with places I have never been. Names of cities and towns that I have to look up on a map. And it does something to me that I have not found a better word for than grateful. You are watching this from places I will never see, living lives I will never fully understand, and yet you stayed with this story for the full length of it. You were here for Linda. You are here for Carol. That matters. The fact that you are here, wherever here is for you tonight, is the reason these stories are worth telling. Tell me where you are watching from. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do that now. Hit the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The community here is something real, and you are part of it. If this story stayed with you, if you are still thinking about Linda sitting in that driveway before she went inside to pack her bag, or Carol counting the rings before she picked up the phone, then subscribe and turn on your notifications. Because what I am bringing you next is going to require every bit of the same attention. The next story I'm telling you is about a woman in rural Pennsylvania who spent 6 years quietly and methodically investigating the house she grew up in. Not because something happened there recently, because something had always felt wrong about it, in a way she could not name for most of her life. And when she finally let herself look at what she found in the basement of her childhood home, she discovered that the family she had always believed she was a part of was not the family she had actually come from. That story involves documents, a DNA test, and a phone call to a stranger who turned out to be the closest blood relative she had. It is coming. Be here for it.